The waste is astonishing. If it were any other department, the Department of Defense would be on the front cover of conservative magazines week in, week out.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Charles C.W. Cooke, who works at National Review and is the author of the new book, The Conservatarian Manifesto, Libertarians, Conservatives, and the Fight for the Right's Future. Charles, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
What is a conservatarian, and why do we need them?
So I'm sure I'm going to get letters about this. This is my take on what conservatarianism is and should be.
Right.
I didn't come up with this word. I've seen this around. People have introduced themselves by saying they're a conservatarian or a liberservative.
Yeah.
They say when I'm...
thank you for not going with libertarian.
Right, I think conservatarian is more euphonious.
Yeah.
But you know, these are the people who say when they're around libertarians, they feel conservative. When they're around conservatives, they feel libertarian. And from what I can see, the fault lines are that they disagree with libertarians on immigration, foreign policy, and sometimes abortion. And they disagree with traditional conservatives on federalism, on gay marriage, and on drugs. And they tend to be disappointed with the Bush years. Not just because of Iraq, sometimes not because of Iraq, but because of No Child Left Behind, of Medicare expansion, of the spending, and of a general feeling that Republicans don't live up to their rhetoric.
So it's a manifesto. What are you manifestoing for? What's the solution that you're after?
So the manifesto part is a little bit of a joke, as is the red cover. This is not a book with 100 policy prescriptions, and there's a reason for that. The heart of the book is federalism. The heart of the book is trying to work out a framework within which the right can coexist and the country can coexist. We do live in a country that's deeply divided. It's a cliche, but it's true. Indeed, we live in a country in which many people have nothing in common with one another at all. If you think about a hipster in Brooklyn or in Portland, Oregon, then you think about a Baptist in Mississippi, they have a common language. That may be it.
And you might be pushing it, right?
Well, right.
How does federalism allow people to, very different people to coexist?
Well, I think if you look at the moment, a key issue is drugs. So you have people in Colorado and people in Washington. They've got together, they've decided to legalize marijuana. Now, personally, I think that's a good thing. I don't think that it should be pushed on people who don't want it for their communities or for their states. But if I had been in Colorado or Washington, I would have voted for it. And along comes Washington, D.C., and says, that's not legal according to us. For the first time, you've got some pushback against federal rules that are at the best unclear and at the worst oppressive. Certainly in theory, the federal government has the right to come down on Colorado and Washington. The race decision made that clear. So I see nothing wrong with a country in which Mississippi or Idaho says no to marijuana and Colorado and Washington say yes, that we don't have to elect a president on this question. We don't have to say, well, I'm voting for Elizabeth Warren because she's in favor of weed. I'm voting against Jeb Bush because he's against it. That's not how it's supposed to work.
What are the limits of that? Or sketch out quickly, because would you say the same thing about liquor? Would it be okay if this state said, we're going to be a dry state, as opposed to doing it at the county or local level, or we're going to have abortion here, or we're going to ban it fully? How do you draw the line between an issue that should be settled at the national level or federal level versus at the state or local level?
Right, well, the two examples that you mentioned, I think constitutionally, yes, a state can ban liquor and it can ban, or I don't think the Roe versus Wade decision is correct. I think it should be able to make its own decision on abortion. Clearly there are some questions that have to be dealt with nationally. They are natural monopolies, if you will. Immigration's one of them. You can't have open borders in California, but not in the other 49 states. You'd have open borders. Similarly, I don't think foreign policy can be conducted by the states, and so you need a national policy here. But most questions can be. Gay marriage can be, abortion can be, the drinking age, and whether one drinks at all can be, taxes, building codes, education.
But I mean, at what level does a right, and how do you decide where a right is the right of an American? Because you wouldn't say racial segregation should be decided at the state level, so why should gender segregation or sexual orientation segregation, so with gay marriage?
I think this comes down to what you believe the Constitution says. Not what you think it should say. I'm in favor of gay marriage, but what it actually says. And so as far as I'm concerned, the Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment, they're clear. Now, I'm very clear in the book, civil rights has to be enforced federally. Not only is there a constitutional justification for that, but I think American history shows it's good policy.
What percentage of conservatives, would you say, are in favor of gay marriage and pot legalization?
Well, this is a generational split, and it's something that the party's going to have a problem with. Increasingly, young Republicans, young conservatives are in favor of gay marriage. I think there's a majority, and depending on who you ask, there is almost a majority for marijuana legalization, or there is a majority. The outlier is abortion. People always talk about these three issues as if they're the same thing. They're not. They're very separate questions.
No, and in fact, younger Americans across the board are more conservative on abortion, or more
Correct.
anti-abortion than older generations, which they're not on the other issues.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah, when you're talking libertarianishly, I find a lot to agree, and I think your book
Sure.
is fantastic. So let's talk about immigration and national defense. One of the things that I think a lot of libertarians, or certainly I do, find bizarre about conservative approaches to immigration is that somehow the government that their conservatives are constantly and rightly harping on as being inefficient and stupid and incapable of tying its own shoes, much less delivering the mail or providing education or anything like that, they're going to be able to both secure the borders in a way that does not infringe on people's civil liberties, but they're also then, when they start talking about, well, we're just going to let in people who can work well and this
Right.
and that, somehow they're going to be able to adjust the demographic population of 300 million plus people to meet all of our needs in terms of ethnic diversity as well as what jobs people can do. How do how can any conservative really think the government is going to be good at that?
Well, I think that's an excellent critique, and I'm not sure I would say government's always going to be good at it. What I would say, and I think Milton Friedman made this point as well, is that we already have a government that is so deeply woven into the economy and into our lives that to just allow people to come in, and if you look at the polling on this, I mean, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people would be to put some pressure on our existing welfare system.
Would that be such a bad thing? Wouldn't that also force reform of the welfare system?
It's possible it would force reform. I'm not so convinced.
We're trying to maximize the contradictions
Well, I'm not convinced by that, in that you hear people say, well, let's go back to how we were 100 years ago, sink or swim, that's why immigration worked. I don't have so much of a problem with that, but I don't think the modern American public is willing to watch people sink or swim once they're here.
Is there any data that would help allay your concerns if we open the borders more so? Because one thing that conservatives say a lot of the times is, I hate people who jump the line or don't stand in the queue. There really is no line or queue for people unless you are related to somebody who's here, or you are, generally speaking, a high-skilled worker who has a job offer from a company. Last year there were about 1 million legal immigrants to the country. There were fewer than that illegals, and that waxes and wanes depending on job opportunity. But if you knew for a fact that immigrants were kept from getting most welfare benefits, if they committed crimes at lower levels, if they actually did come here to work and that was basically what they did, would that allay your concerns about opening up the country to more immigration?
It would allay some of those fears. I do think, and this is perhaps where a conservative like me on this disagrees with a libertarian like you, I do think the existing polity gets to decide who joins them. And I do think they get to set the criteria by which those new arrivals are permitted to enter the country. Now, I'm under no illusions that that's going to work perfectly all the time. Of course it's not. As you say, government is incompetent.
They let a lot of people with strange accents into this country.
Well, they do.
Yes.
They do, myself included.
Yes. Oh, really? I thought that was a speech impediment. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just putting it on to sell books. Right.
Do you worry about the cultural assimilation argument that a lot of conservatives seem to be very upset about when, and I hear a lot of people who say, you know what I can't stand is when I'm walking through a street in an American city and I hear a foreign language. Do you worry about that type of
I don't worry
problem?
about the language so much, no, because if you look at the adoption of English, how long it takes for immigrants to adopt English, it does seem to be a lot shorter now than it was 100 years ago. That's not what worries me so much. What worries me is that 100 years ago, you couldn't burden your fellow or new fellow countrymen as quickly as you can now. You couldn't vote to change the government. You couldn't vote for a big government party that would ride roughshod over the Constitution. You couldn't raise taxes by demanding more benefits and so forth. Now, I agree with you that it would change the equation slightly if it could be guaranteed that newcomers would not use welfare benefits. But statistically, they do.
Not very much. I mean, the data that I've seen, if you count public education for kids through K through 12, oftentimes who are born here and then are American citizens, and some hospital, admissions. But they are actually banned from most other forms of welfare. So, I mean, they'll take some, they may get some food stamps, they may get some, aid to families with dependent children type of programs, but it's pretty minimal.
Right. I think this probably is going to depend on how we define it. But if you look at the long-term use of welfare by those who entered the country as immigrants and their children, it has added a considerable amount to the rolls over that since 1965. That's a conscious decision that we made. Now, I accept there are arguments on both sides. I accept some economists would say, well, yes, but they also contribute to the tax rolls, they also fill those jobs, they're also entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. But again, I think that decision is for the polity to make. If you open the borders, you take it out of their hands and you allow those people to change the country. And I think countries are fragile, they're more than just economies.
Let's talk about national defense. You recognize in the book that Iraq and Afghanistan were basically disasters.
Correct.
That these did not go the way the architects of them wanted at all. Do other conservatives agree with you on that? Because I don't see a lot of kind of thinking through the next intervention, and we're already seeing a lot of very high-profile conservatives, people at the National Review, people at the Weekly Standard, calling about, okay, now we've got to really start bombing Iran or something close to it. People like Tom Cotton in the Republican Party, there's a lot of real firebrands out there. Is it really just out of the presidential candidates even? Is it just Rand Paul, the only one who's saying, and even he, from a libertarian perspective, I wouldn't quite say he's a warmonger, but he's no shrinking violet in this. But are there are conservatives who actually agree Iraq and Afghanistan were disastrous, and we need to be slow before we embroil ourselves in the third act of these two disasters?
There are some, but I don't think there are enough. And I make the point in the book that Barack Obama came in on the back of a certain anti-Iraq sentiment, and it wasn't contrary to the American character. The American character flits to and fro on the question of its role in the world. The anti-interventionist sentiment has been there from the founding, and it bubbles up occasionally. It bubbled up after the First World War, it bubbled up after Vietnam, it's bubbled up after Iraq. We are now seeing a little bit of a return. Now, how many conservatives take my position, which is that the United States needs to be strong, needs to be the strongest nation in the world and to retain its position there, but that Iraq was a mistake, that one doesn't have to lead to the other, I don't know.
In order to be the strongest country in the world, do we have to increase defense spending from what it's at now? Do we have to every once in a while drop some bombs somewhere to make, to keep it fresh in their mind that we mean business? Sure. Because I think a lot of libertarians, and if we're talking about trying to forge an alliance between the two, they're not against defense spending, and they're not, as long as it's not ridiculous or constantly increasing, and they're in favor of national defense.
Yeah. Well, look, I should say full disclosure on this one. This is not one of the areas, and I make this clear in the book, on which I think conservatives and libertarians can compromise or coexist. I come out and say I think conservatives are closer to the truth on this. To those questions, I don't think we need to drop bombs to remind people we're in charge, although if you are going to be the indispensable nation, you are sometimes going to have to get involved. Right. I think we would probably agree on the basics that we needed to fight the Japanese and we needed to fight Nazi Germany, and then we disagree on some of the other smaller questions. On the question of defense spending, I think conservatives really damage themselves here. It does not need to increase permanently every year. Secondly, the waste is astonishing. If it were any other department, the Department of Defense would be on the front cover of conservative magazines week in, week out. Recently it was revealed that they can't even audit themselves. They don't even know where the money is going. And this is a huge problem. That being said, I think in 1945 the British Empire began to collapse. The baton was handed to the United States. It finds itself in a position of power, and it cannot relinquish that without permitting another nation to come in and take that role, and I do not want to see that.
Does it matter that America is not an empire, or it never sought to be an empire? And is part of the reason that the British Empire collapsed is precisely because it was not a republic anymore, but it turned into an empire, and spent a lot of time maintaining colonies through military force and military presence all around the world, rather than becoming a better and better trader and a stronger and stronger beacon internally of the values that it sought to project throughout the world?
I don't think they're quite comparable. I think the British Empire was there in various forms for 250, 300 years, and even in the 18th century you had Macaulay saying that the greatest day would be when the imperial possessions could be given up.
Yeah.
America's never wanted that role, maybe a brief flirtation with it in the early 20th century. It got that role because its closest historical and ideological partner collapsed in exhaustion after the Second World War. Now, I understand people find that frustrating. The instinct, the American instinct since the founding has been to throw up one's hands and say, no, we don't want to be in this position. But it is in this position. And I think reluctantly one just has to accept that.
Talk a bit about entitlements, middle-class entitlements, old age entitlements. A lot of conservatives, including some of your colleagues at National Review, will say things like, oh, well, of course conservatives want to solve Social Security's problems, but they also are like, this is a middle-class entitlement and we shouldn't really be getting rid of it. It seems like a lot of libertarians are more of the mindset that these are unsustainable transfers of wealth from relatively young, relatively poor people to relatively rich, relatively old and politically connected people.
Right.
Is the entitlement question, how do conservatives and libertarians line up in your view of things?
So I'm more radical on this than a lot of conservatarians. So I was about to use my own word, conservatives. We are seeing an intergenerational wealth transfer at the moment that was not what was intended by Medicare or Social Security. More importantly, we know that it's unsustainable and we're choosing it anyway. And I think that's the unforgivable part of this. If you read Middlemarch by George Eliot, this is an odd comparison, but bear with me. Rosamond starts to spend money that she and her husband don't have. Not because he needs it to tide him over bad times or because he thinks that it will help him invest in his future, but because she wants stuff. She thinks it's the better way to live. America's got itself into a position with entitlement spending in which the people have been convinced that although they can't afford these entitlement spending, it would be immoral to get rid of them, or at least to reform them or restructure them. I think that's immoral in and of itself. I also think, and I understand this is a radical suggestion, but I also think many of those entitlements can be pushed back to the states. I see, or at least privatized. So no, I'm not a protector of entitlements in that way.
Libertarians are often accused, really, of having an unfair appeal to young people because we'll talk about drugs, we'll talk about sex, we'll talk about rock and roll. Right. We, eschew tradition, often have a contrarian or an anti-authoritarian point of view. What is the appeal of conservatism to a younger generation? And it does seem as if when you look at polling, including polling that Reason did last year of millennials, there's a sour taste for most millennials towards conservatives.
Well, I do think you're right. I think that split on drugs and sex is probably important. Conservatism is successful when the alternatives have failed or are deemed to be unviable. Now, my view is that in the upcoming years, libertarians and conservatives will have to work together in order to take power. They're not happy bedfellows often, but they are probably going to be happier than they would be if they were with progressives. I don't think that means that young people are suddenly going to love conservatives. Indeed, I'm not sure that means that anyone's going to suddenly love conservatives. But if there is enough of a coalition, if there is enough of enough comity between the two movements, then you may be able to combine some of the libertarian appeal. I think gay marriage and marijuana is appealing to young people, as I said, and the facts of life part of conservatism that after Barack Obama and his experiment, and probably given the entitlements crisis that we're facing, is going to look more attractive.
What binds conservatives and libertarians together more than a kind of historical or sociological accident? And it's interesting talking to somebody who's writing a National Review, which really created the modern right, which was founded by conservatives and some libertarians. I mean, there was the whole concept of fusionism, that anti-communism particularly was a strong enough overarching goal that conservatives and libertarians could get along. That was always a fraught alliance, certainly after the Cold War it started falling apart, as I think people at least in America in a post-war setting, classical liberals of a libertarian variety versus conservatives, realized there were a lot of differences. So other than the kind of historical accident that the people who founded National Review the people who created a kind of right that consisted, brought to light people like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, who enjoyed broad support among conservatives and libertarians. Is there a glue there other than a rejection of progressivism, or is that actually the main kind of coming together point?
Well, I think that they are, I think philosophically they start from the same point even if they don't end up in the same place. Libertarians and conservatives mistrust the centralizer who tells you he knows everything. They don't believe that human nature changes. They are mistrustful of power. And I try to make this point in the book, that conservative is really the wrong word. Sometimes conservatives can glom onto an accident of history and just defend it to the death. Sometimes conservatives can fail to recognize that civil society had thrown up institutions that were good for one era but not for another. But generally speaking, the day after the revolution, everyone is a conservative. And the American foundational ideals are radical. They're not stodgy in the English sense. Conservatives in England believe in the monarchy and the Church of England. They believe in tradition. They believe in the House of Lords. In America, they don't. Now, there are certain fracture points at which conservatives begin to side with social institutions that libertarians think are useless. And my criticism of libertarians, the other direction, is that I think they can often fail to value those social institutions. They think the world is an algebra question.
Give some examples of that.
If we go back to immigration, the United States is odd historically. It's not how most countries have been, this relative peace, these classically liberal ideas, the inculcation of due process and free speech and so forth in the minds of the citizenry. These are not normal. These are not normal national traits.
Certainly not common.
No, and they didn't spring up overnight. And I think that nations are more than merely economies, and that what keeps that going is partly the Bill of Rights and partly the Supreme Court and the sort of the churches and the baseball leagues, but it's partly people and a long and slow train that runs back to Britain and Magna Carta and time immemorial. And I think if you throw too many new people in, if you don't recognize that there is some work to be done with assimilation, then you're at risk of losing that.
Well, let me ask a final question. There's a fear among libertarians that conservatives always come a courting every presidential election season, and actually in 2003. National Review ran a cover story talking about unpatriotic dissenters in America and whatnot, and but then by 2000, as the election was heating up, it was like, hey, can't conservatives and libertarians be friends? We're really on the same team here. Libertarians are kind of doing well lately. Things like gay marriage, things like pot legalization, things like criminal justice reform, certain types of disruptive innovations, permissionless innovation. They're coming in a direction that seems to be going pretty well for us. How do libertarians know that the idea of a conservatarian outreach is not just the old thing of like, hey, you got to roll with us now because we've got an election. It's too important to elect somebody who it does not at least mouth certain certain oaths that libertarians like to hear.
Well, I think the conservatarian term is not a linguistic trick. It's a substantive attempt to describe a certain sort of coterie on the right. And the good news is that the people that I'm discussing, by and large, approve of all of those developments that you're discussing. And this is an infusion within the right in general. You can call it within conservatism, within the Republican Party, or just within the right, if you like, that is changing conservatism, and certainly generationally is changing conservatism.
Talk very briefly then about the generational aspect of this, because it does seem, we're taught to talk about things in terms of right and left, but it turns out that it might be young and old, or whether chronologically or just kind of mentally, seems to be more important.
Well, that's a good point too, because progressives often like Uber as well. I've never met, and I accept there must be one out there, I've never met a young traditional conservative, whatever their views on gay marriage, who doesn't like Uber over the taxi commission, who doesn't prefer his iPhone than the DMV or the IRS. So I think there's two things going on. The first is those libertarian ideals are being applied to conservatives. It's not as if conservatives are playing nice. The other point is just generationally, as you say. Progressives, liberals, even socialists are seduced by this market change. So in that area, I don't think you're going to have a problem. You probably will in foreign policy and immigration, I'll be honest with you.
Yeah, no, I don't doubt that at all. Well, thank you. It's a really interesting read. The Conservatarian Manifesto, Libertarians, Conservatives, and the Fight for the Right's Future by Charles C.W. Cooke, writer for National Review. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I've never met a conservative who calls himself corporatist, but I've met a lot of corporatists on Capitol Hill who call themselves conservative.
Libertarian is more euphonious.
Yeah.
But you know, these are the people who say when they're around libertarians, they feel conservative. When they're around conservatives, they feel libertarian. And from what I can see, the fault lines are that they disagree with libertarians on immigration, foreign policy, and sometimes abortion. And they disagree with traditional conservatives on federalism, on gay marriage, and on drugs. And they tend to be disappointed with the Bush years. Not just because of Iraq, sometimes not because of Iraq, but because of No Child Left Behind, of Medicare expansion, of the spending, and of a general feeling that Republicans don't live up to their rhetoric.
So it's a manifesto. What are you manifestoing for? What's the solution that you're after?
So the manifesto part is a little bit of a joke, as is the red cover. This is not a book with 100 policy prescriptions, and there's a reason for that. The heart of the book, the waste, is astonishing. If it were any other department, the Department of Defense would be on the front cover of conservative magazines, week in, week out.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Charles C.W. Cooke, who works at National Review and is the author of the new book, The Conservatarian Manifesto, Libertarians, Conservatives, and the Fight for the Right's Future. Charles, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
What is a conservatarian, and why do we need them?
So I'm sure I'm going to get letters about this. This is my take on what conservatarianism is and should be.
Right.
I didn't come up with this word. I've seen this around. People have introduced themselves by saying they're a conservatarian or a liberservative.
Yeah.
They say
So
when I'm...
thank you for not going with libertarian.
Right, I think conservative is federalism. The heart of the book is trying to work out a framework within which the right can coexist and the country can coexist. We do live in a country that's deeply divided. It's a cliche, but it's true. Indeed, we live in a country in which many people have nothing in common with one another at all. If you think about a hipster in Brooklyn or in Portland, Oregon, then you think about a Baptist in Mississippi. They have a common language. That may be it.
And you might be pushing it, right?
Well, right.
How does federalism allow people very different people to coexist?
Well, I think if you look at the moment, a key issue is drugs. So you have people in Colorado and people in Washington. They've got together, they've decided to legalize marijuana. Now, personally, I think that's a good thing. I don't think that it should be pushed on people who don't want it for their communities or for their states, but if I had been in Colorado or Washington, I would have voted for it. And along comes Washington, D.C., and says, that's not legal according to us. For the first time, you've got some pushback against federal rules that are at the best unclear and at the worst oppressive. Certainly in theory, the federal government has the right to come down on Colorado and Washington. The race decision made that clear. So I see nothing wrong with a country in which Mississippi or Idaho says no to marijuana and Colorado and Washington say yes, that we don't have to elect a president on this question. We don't have to say, well, I'm voting for Elizabeth Warren because she's in favor of weed, I'm voting against Jeb Bush because he's against it. That's not how it's supposed to work.
What are the limits of that? Or sketch out quickly, because would you say the same thing about liquor? Would it be okay if this state said, we're going to be a dry state, as opposed to doing it at the county or local level, or we're going to have abortion here, or we're going to ban it fully? How do you draw the line between an issue that should be settled at the national level or federal level versus at the state or local level?
Right, well, the two examples that you mentioned, I think constitutionally, yes, a state can ban liquor and it can ban, or I don't think the Roe versus Wade decision is correct. I think it should be able to make its own decision on abortion. Clearly there are some questions that have to be dealt with nationally. They are natural monopolies, if you will. Immigration's one of them. You can't have open borders in California, but not in the other 49 states. You'd have open borders. Similarly, I don't think foreign policy can be conducted by the states, and so you need a national policy here. But most questions can be. Gay marriage can be, abortion can be, the drinking age, and whether one drinks at all can be, taxes, building codes, education.
But I mean, at what level does